The temperature dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius on the night of January 7th, 1879, in the Missouri Ozarks. Not a gradual descent. A hard, sudden fall that cracked the bark on oak trees and turned the creek south of Miller County into a solid gray shelf of ice before sunrise. Families that had lived in these hills for 2 generations knew what that kind of cold meant. It meant you fed your fire through the night, you burned through your woodpile faster than you planned, and you hoped your chimney didn't choke. On the edge of a clearing roughly 4 miles east of the town of Tuscumbia, a man named Elias Morrow was finishing something that nobody in the county had seen before. From the outside, it looked wrong. The cabin was modest, low walls, a steeply pitched roof, a chimney that sat in an unusual position along the north wall. Calvin Pruitt, the most respected mason in the region, a man who had laid foundations from Springfield to the Gasconade River, looked at it once and shook his head. Local accounts record his words as direct and final. That is the most dangerous folly this county has ever seen. By March of that same year, Pruitt will be standing inside that cabin with measuring tape, saying nothing at all. What Elias Morrow understood about heat, about what stone does with fire after the fire goes out, was something the experts had stopped thinking about. Today, you're going to see exactly what he built, why it terrified the professionals, and what happened when the worst winter in a decade put every theory to the test. If you want to receive a real technique like this every single week, methods that worked when people's lives depended on them, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Every video on this channel is a story that the history books left out. Don't miss the next one. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Elias Morrow was 43 years old in the winter of 1878, and he had no intention of becoming famous. He had spent 15 years as a blacksmith in Cooper County before a land opportunity pulled him south into the Ozark Hills, where he settled with his wife, Margaret, and their 3 children on 40 acres of rocky, timbered ground along the Osage River watershed. He was not a builder by trade. He was a man who understood metal and fire, what heat does to iron, how long a forge holds temperature after the bellows stop, how mass determines duration. That knowledge would matter more than he expected. The standard approach to heating a cabin in the Missouri Ozarks in the 1870s was straightforward and brutal in its inefficiency. A central brick fireplace, open-faced, with a wide firebox and a tall chimney designed to pull smoke out fast. It worked. It heated the immediate area around the fire to a reasonable temperature, 65 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius to 21 degrees Celsius, while the fire burned. But the moment the fire dropped, the heat went with it. The stone and brick of a standard Ozark fireplace, typically 6 to 8 inches thick, had very little capacity to store energy. It heated up fast and cooled down just as fast. By 3 o'clock in the morning, when families were deep in sleep and the fire had burned low, interior temperatures in standard Ozark cabins regularly fell to 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius to 6 degrees Celsius. Children sleeping near the floor, where cold air pooled, woke up stiff. The first hour after waking was spent coaxing a fire back to life from wet wood and ash. And the firewood itself was a constant problem. Ozark winters brought extended damp periods that soaked cut timber before it could season properly, and burning green or wet would produce more smoke than heat, fouling the chimney and filling the cabin with low, persistent haze that burned the eyes and settled in the lungs. Elias Morrow watched all of this, the wasted wood, the cold floors, the smoke, and approached it the way a blacksmith approaches a poorly designed forge. He didn't see a comfort problem. He saw an engineering problem, and he was convinced the solution wasn't more fire. It was better stone. What Elias built was not a fireplace in any conventional sense. It was, in the language of modern building science, a thermal mass heating system, though Elias himself would never have used those words. He called it, according to a letter preserved in the Miller County Historical Collection, simply the wall that holds. The construction began with a limestone wall, not beside the fireplace, not behind it, but built directly around the firebox on 3 sides, with a stone extending 14 inches, about 36 centimeters, thick on each face. Limestone was a material Elias knew from the local creek beds, dense, heavy, with a specific heat capacity that made it exceptionally good at absorbing and retaining thermal energy. Where a standard brick fireplace might weigh 800 to 1,000 pounds, Elias's limestone surround weighed an estimated 3,200 to 3,600 pounds. That mass was the point. Here is the physics. Explained simply. When you light a fire, the heat it generates has to go somewhere. In a standard open fireplace, most of that heat, estimates from period engineering manuals suggest as much as 70% to 80%, escapes directly up the chimney as convective loss. You feel warmth while the fire burns, but the room is heating the outdoors as much as it's heating you. Elias's design redirected that energy. The thick limestone walls surrounding the firebox absorb the heat during combustion and store it the way a blacksmith's anvil holds warmth long after the forge cools, slowly, steadily, and for hours. He added a second element that drew even more skepticism: a low, enclosed channel running beneath the floorboards, roughly 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall, lined with flat limestone slabs. Hot air from the firebox base was drawn through this channel by natural convection, warm air rising and pulling cooler air behind it, and distributed beneath the floor before exiting through a small vent on the cabin's east wall. The result was a radiant floor effect. The wooden planks above the channel stayed 10 degrees Fahrenheit to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius to 8 degrees Celsius, warmer than the ambient air, and that warmth rose slowly and evenly through the living space. The chimney position was what disturbed people most. Instead of rising from the center or the end wall, both standard configurations, Elias positioned his flue along the north wall, with a longer horizontal run to the limestone mass before it turned vertical. This extended path allowed the exhaust gases to surrender more of their remaining heat to stone before escaping outside. The trade-off was a slower draft, which meant the fire needed to be built more carefully and kept cleaner. Elias understood this. He built a small ash trap beneath the firebox grate, a detail local accounts suggest that he derived from watching how his forge's ash management affected airflow. Every piece of the system was considered. He left a 4-inch air gap between the limestone surround and any wooden framing element, well beyond the 2-inch clearance that was standard practice, because he intended the stone to run genuinely hot. He built a small exterior access panel into the floor channel for cleaning. He graded the ground beneath the cabin's stone foundation to drain water away from the base of the wall, preventing moisture from wicking up into the limestone and degrading its thermal performance over time. None of this was visible from outside. From outside, it just looked like an oddly built chimney and a cabin with unusually thick walls near the hearth, and that, to his neighbors, was more than enough reason to talk. Calvin Pruitt arrived at the Morrow property in late October of 1878, not long after the walls were complete and the floor channel had been sealed. He came, by his own account, recorded in a letter to his brother in Greene County, out of professional curiosity. He left out of professional alarm. Pruitt had been laying stone in the Ozarks for over 2 decades. He had built fireplace surrounds, foundations, well casings, and chimneys across a 60-mile radius. He knew limestone. He knew draft, and what he saw in Elias Morrow's cabin violated, in his estimation, every principle of safe and functional hearth construction. The chimney run was too long and too horizontal. It would lose draft and backsmoke cabin. The firebox was too small for the volume of space it needed to heat. The floor channel was an invitation for moisture accumulation and rot, and the weight of that limestone surround, resting on what Pruitt assessed as an inadequate foundation, would settle unevenly within 2 winters and crack the firebox apart. He stated his conclusions plainly in front of Elias and 2 neighboring men who had come to watch. That wall will sweat, rot your floor, and smoke your family out by February. Local accounts attribute to him. He reportedly paused, looked once more at the extended chimney run, and added, "And if the draft fails in a hard wind, you won't have smoke to worry about. You'll have fire." The neighbors carried the verdict back to Tuscumbia faster than Pruitt's horse did. The community's reaction followed a predictable pattern. There was laughter, not hostile, but the kind of laughter that signals collective agreement about what is sensible and what is not. The cabin acquired a nickname that spread to the area's small settlements, the Stone Fool's Cabin. The man who supplied cordwood to most of the valley's families made his assessment in a single sentence, delivered publicly at the Tuscumbia General Store. A man who builds small fires in Ozark January is either brave or fool, and you don't look brave to me. Elias Morrow's children, oral accounts from the family suggest, heard variations of that judgment at school. His oldest son, Thomas, then 14, reportedly stopped explaining his father's project to his classmates after the third or fourth attempt produced more ridicule than understanding. Elias himself said very little. He finished the ash trap. He sealed the floor channel. He laid the last course of limestone on the north wall. And then he waited for January. Stay with me to the end of this chapter, because the number that came out of the next 19 days shut every critic in the county. The cold front arrived on January 3rd, 1879, and it did not behave like a normal Ozark winter. Meteorological records from the period, preserved in Missouri State Archives, describe a sustained Arctic intrusion that held the region below 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius for 19 consecutive days, with nighttime lows reaching minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit minus 28 degrees Celsius on at least 4 occasions. The wind came from the northwest without pause, cutting through valley cabins and finding every gap in every wall. What made it particularly punishing was the moisture that preceded the cold snap. A wet December had soaked the region's cut timber. Wood piles that families had stacked in November were wet 3 inches deep, and burning wetwood in an open fireplace produces, at best, half the usable heat of seasoned dry wood, while generating far more creosote, which clings to chimney walls, reduces draft, and in the worst cases, ignites. The valley's families began burning through their wood piles at a rate nobody had planned for. Standard Ozark fireplaces, already inefficient under ideal conditions, became nearly unmanageable with wet fuel. Fires required constant attention. Chimneys partially blocked by creosote buildup choked the draft, forcing smoke back into living spaces. Families reported burning furniture by the second week. Children and elderly members were moved into a single room and kept close to fires that burned through the night, consuming wood that nobody could afford to lose. 3 families in the valley, oral accounts indicate, sent members to stay with relatives in town before the cold broke. At the Morrow cabin, for miles east of Tuscumbia, the morning routine was different. Elias woke at 5:30 each morning, added wood to a fire that had been burning since the previous morning, and fed it for 3 to 4 hours. Then he let it fall to coals. Then he let the coals go cold. He did not build another fire until the following morning. His family ate supper in a warm room. His children slept through the night without waking from cold. The floor, over the limestone-lined channel, stayed noticeably warm to bare feet, a detail Margaret Morrow mentioned in a letter to her sister in Boonville, describing it as the one thing that made January feel like something we could manage. Nobody came to check on the Morrows during the cold snap. Everyone else was managing their own crisis. The cold broke on January 22nd, and the valley began taking stock of what the previous 19 days had cost. The accounting was social as much as material. Families compared woodpile levels with a frankness that hard winters produce, because next year's planning depended on honest numbers. And the numbers that circulated through the Tuscumbia settlement in the weeks after the thaw were, for most households, grim. A typical Ozark family cabin, approximately 400 to 500 square feet, heated by a standard open brick fireplace, had burned between 0.9 and 1.1 cords of wood per week during the cold snap. Over 19 days, roughly 2 3/4 weeks, that represented between 2.5 and 3 cords consumed under emergency conditions. The Morrow household's consumption, which Elias recorded in a small account ledger that survived in the family's possession, was 0.4 to 0.5 cords per week. Over the same 19-day period, he had burned approximately 1.1 to 1.3 cords total, less than half of what comparable households reported. But the wood consumption figure, striking as it was, told only part of the story. The more revealing measure was temperature retention. On the morning of January 11th, a morning when the overnight low had reached minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 26 degrees Celsius, Elias recorded the interior temperature of the cabin at 6 a.m. before the morning fire was lit. His notation, written in the same account ledger, reads simply, "Inside, 61 degrees. Fire out since 9 the prior evening. That was 9 hours without active combustion, in the coldest week of the coldest winter the Ozarks had seen in a decade, with an exterior temperature that had dropped to within a few degrees of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. No fire. For comparison, families with standard open fireplaces in cabins of similar size reported interior morning temperatures, again, before relighting, of between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius. That range sits uncomfortably close to freezing. At those temperatures, water in pitchers turns to slush. Children wake up with stiff fingers. The act of getting the fire going again becomes urgent rather than routine. The difference between 61 degrees Fahrenheit and 36 degrees Fahrenheit is not a comfort difference. In January, in the Ozarks, with wet wood and an unreliable draft, that difference is a safety margin. The floor channel contributed in ways that the raw temperature numbers don't fully capture. Because the limestone line duct distributed warmth across the underside of the floorboards, the Morrow cabin maintained a thermal gradient that conventional cabins lacked. The air near the floor, where children played, where drafts pooled, where cold was most punishing, stayed measurably warmer than the air near the ceiling. In a standard open fireplace cabin, that relationship is often reversed. Warm air rises to the ceiling while cold air settles at floor level. Elias's system, by heating from below, turned that gradient right side up. His firewood, stored in a small lean-to attached to the cabin's south wall, stayed dry throughout the cold snap. The lean-to's design, intentional, with the cabin's wall on the north side providing thermal buffering, meant the store would never dip below 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius, which was cold but not wet. Every morning fire caught cleanly on the first try. Calvin Pruitt's prediction, smoke your family out by February, did not come to pass. The extended chimney run produced a slower but consistent draft, and the cleaner burn that Elias maintained was seasoned, dry wood meant minimal creosote accumulation. The chimney was swept once in March. As a precaution, it was by all accounts notably clean. Calvin Pruitt came to the Morrow cabin in the last week of February, after the thaw, without announcement. Elias was splitting wood in the yard when he arrived. Oral accounts passed through the Morrow family described the visit as brief and quiet. Pruitt asked to see the firebox. He walked the perimeter of the limestone surround with his hands touching the stone, cold now, in late February, with no fire going. And then he asked for a measuring tape. He measured the wall thickness. He measured the floor channel opening. He looked at the chimney run and said nothing about it. Before he left, he asked Elias one question. How long did the stone take to reach full temperature on the first day of a cold snap, after being cold all fall? Elias told him, between 6 and 8 hours of continuous fire, the first time. After that, the mass held a baseline that made subsequent heating faster. Pruitt nodded. He did not apologize. He rode back toward Tuscumbia, without further comment. But something had shifted. Within the following weeks, 2 of Pruitt's clients, men who had heard his October verdict and taken it as the final word, came separately to Elias to ask questions. They weren't hostile. They were practical. They wanted to know if the floor channel was difficult to build, and whether Creek limestone was suitable or if quarried stone was necessary. Elias answered both questions in detail. He showed them the access panel for cleaning the channel. He explained the importance of the air gap between stone and wood framing. He did not charge them anything. He was a blacksmith, not a contractor. By the winter of 1880 to 1881, local accounts and property records suggest that at least 9 cabins within a 30-mile radius of Tuscumbia had incorporated some version of a heavy limestone hearth around. Most without the floor channel, which required more labor, but several with a simplified version using flat stones under the floor near the firebox. The technique spread the way genuinely useful things spread in rural communities. Not through endorsement, not through publication, but through the visible fact of one family's warm floors and half-empty woodpile. The Firewood supplier from the general store lost 3 regular customers the following winter. No record indicates that he ever connected the reduction in business to the Morrow cabin. By 1883, the construction was being referred to in the valley simply as a Morrow wall, a term that carried no formal definition, no written specification, and no attribution beyond the name of a blacksmith-turned-farmer who had once been called a fool for building small fires. Elias himself, according to his son Thomas's later recollections, never described what he'd built as an invention. He called it the obvious thing, once you worked a forge long enough to understand what stone remembers. He wasn't being stubborn. He wasn't being modest. He was being precise. Here is the thing that Calvin Pruitt understood perfectly and missed entirely. He understood fire. He understood draft, chimney geometry, firebox proportion mortar ratios. He had built dozens of functional, durable fireplaces across 2 decades and 2 counties. By every conventional measure, he was right. Elias Morrow's chimney run was longer than standard, his firebox was smaller than recommended, and his stone surround was heavier than anything Pruitt had seen used for residential heating in the Ozarks. What Pruitt missed was a question Elias was actually trying to answer. Pruitt was building systems to heat rooms. Elias was building a system to store heat, and then release it slowly, for hours, long after the fuel was gone. These are not the same problem. They require different solutions. And in the winter of 1879, in a valley where wet wood and a sustained Arctic front had made continuous combustion nearly impossible, the ability to store heat, to charge the stone in the morning and let it discharge at night, was worth more than a perfectly proportioned firebox. The physics behind what Elias built has a formal name today: thermal mass. Dense materials, limestone, sandstone, fired brick, rammed earth, cast iron, have a measurable capacity to absorb heat energy and release it slowly over time. The heavier and denser material, the more energy it can store per degree of temperature rise, and the longer it takes to lose that stored energy to the surrounding air. A 14-inch limestone wall surrounding a firebox doesn't just reflect heat back into the room while the fire burns. It absorbs heat, holds it, and slowly radiates it for 6, 8, 10 hours after combustion ends. Modern passive house construction, Russian masonry heaters, Catch-a-loaf stoves from Central Europe, all of them operate on the same principle that a Missouri blacksmith worked out from first principles in a rocky Ozark clearing in 1878. Elias Morrow did not invent thermal mass. The principle appears in vernacular architecture across dozens of cultures: in the adobe walls of the American Southwest, in the Kong bedstoves of northern China, in the stone longhouses of the Scottish Highlands, in the earthen walls of the Great Plains sod houses. What he did was apply a principle he understood intuitively, from working iron over a coal forge, from watching how the anvil held heat hours after the fire was banked, to a problem his neighbors were solving with brute force. The lesson is not that the experts were incompetent. Calvin Pruitt was a skilled craftsman. The lesson is that expertise built around one set of assumptions. In this case, the assumption that a heating system exists to produce heat while it burns can become a blind spot when the actual problem requires a different frame entirely. Elias Morrow's cabin was not a miracle. It was an engineering decision made by someone who had spent enough years working with heat to understand that fire is temporary, but mass is patient. This video is produced for educational and historical purposes. The techniques described reflect historical vernacular construction practices and should not be treated as engineering specifications. Always consult qualified professionals before modifying or constructing any heating system. If this story changed the way you think about heat and how buildings work, hit like and subscribe. Every week we bring you another technique from the people who figured it out the hard way, long before anyone was writing it down. And now we want to hear from you. Which part of Elias' solution would you actually apply to your own home or property today? The limestone surround? The floor channel? The firewood storage design? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. We've had viewers from Alaska to Finland to Patagonia, and every single location tells its own winter story. See you in the next one.